Welcome to the PI Podcast, Political Insights for the Palaging Inis. I'm your host, Matt, and with me is my co-host, the Michelangelo of memes and the Machiavellian Manong, Borg.
Okay, the second one got me. Okay. PI nyo, PI nating lahat, Borg here at your service.
Yes, and this is a special episode because if you haven't checked us out yet, we just released Understanding Ideology because we have two listener questions which asked, of course, what is the political spectrum like? And the second question is, what are our thoughts on the right wing, like right-wing conservatism? And we decided to expand it into a whole series. So we're going to interview people of different political ideologies from the different positions of the political spectrum, and specifically in the Philippines, because this political spectrum, we know about the left and the right in any country, but we haven't reflected the left and right here in the Philippines, some more obvious than others. And we are starting with the right wing and conservatism. Now, before we introduce our special guest, who will no doubt give us great insights on conservatism, Borj, any comments on conservatism in the Philippines?
Okay, first, I think we need to suspend the left and right for now. So, ano muna tayo? We will explore ideologies ground up. So, let's suspend the dichotomy between left and right. But just say a brief summary as far as my own readings on conservatism is concerned. And again, by the way, I'm a thorough radical. So I expose myself. Yeah, I expose myself to conservative writings. Well, first, as you know your enemy thing, but I have found so much to learn from conservative thinkers as well, and much to criticize, but much to learn as well. So as of now, I think we can sum it up as having three dimensions. So we need to have distinctions between economic, social, and political conservatism. So economic conservatism, you would have here the liberal free marketers would be there as well. For the social conservatives, this would be those who would uphold traditions, social traditions, social norms. For political conservatives, this would be valuing authority and a hierarchy. So these are the basic definitions of what conservatism is. But yeah, I think that's just a basic rundown as far as the West is concerned. So this is the Western experience of conservatism.
We actually started this discussion a bit in our previous video. Check that out, PI Nyo, our segment there, Understanding Ideology. And we mentioned there that, of course, the right and left wing distinctions are Western, and we want to contextualize and ground it here in the Philippines.
Yeah.
And when you look at from my point of view, a lot of people somewhat feel, conservative. They have conservative tendencies, especially if their politics comes a lot from like church teaching. When they quote the Bible in politics, that's the stereotype of the political conservative in the Philippines. But if you notice in the literature, local scholars don't really spend a lot of time reflecting on the right. There's a lot of publications on the left, and of course on populism, which can be left, right, or whatever, but not quite on the conservative right, despite having a lot of, when you look at the characterizations of the Philippines, a lot of people say or presume it is conservative because a lot of, say, objections to progressive policies are, based on the Bible or religious convictions, etc. But is that, of course, this is one part of conservatism in the Philippines, but there are more, and we will explore with our special guest here. So without further ado, let's welcome the host of the Jay Aruga Podcast, which is, subtitle is The First Conservative Podcast in the Philippines. So please welcome Jay Aruga.
Hey, kamusta, Matt and Borj? Thanks for inviting me here.
Thank you for
coming sa mga audience ng PI Podcast.
Maraming salamat.
Thank you. Yeah, I think your podcast is one of the, of course, noticeable ones because, again, the first conservative podcast in the Philippines. In fact, when I was scoping out, of course, the podcasts in the Podcast PH group and Facebook, yours is noticeable. Again, conservative. So why don't you tell us why you decided to make a conservative podcast?
Oh, good question. Because I started my podcast last 2019. It was election season here in our country.
Yeah.
And it was the senatorial elections. during that time.
Mm-hmm.
And it came to a point that I'm kinda nainis ako sa parang Bangayan, Duterte, and Dilawan that time. I didn't intend it to be a conservative podcast at first. At first, I was just talking about like some stuff on philosophies like fallacies, for example. And I love talking about, let's say, moral relativism, the difference between faith and reason, or how they interact. So eventually, medyo I kinda tried to market like the podcast as a conservative podcast, because at first I was looking at the selections of podcasts in the rankings, and most are liberal podcasts, or leaning to the left side of the spectrum, meaning they're very open to discussing the sexcapades or hookup culture, and most are on the LGBTQ plus agenda. So I realized there's not much conservative podcast out there in the Philippines, because on the US there you have the Daily Wire. So there's Ben Shapiro, Matt Walsh, etc. And there's Stephen Crowder, Andrew Clavin, Stephen Crowder, So those guys in the Philippines, I don't see a conservative movement that time when I started the podcast. So that's why I kind of took the name, because someone might beat me to it. Before someone
smart move.
Yeah. So I kind of like cockily took the name conservative and branded the podcast as the first. At that time, I branded it as the first and only conservative podcast in the Philippines.
Yes.
But I took out the only, because there's a gray area with like Christian podcast, because they're kind of conservative din naman.
Yes.
Yeah, I kind of took I just left the first para medyo may konting bragging rights pa rin. That's the story of the podcast.
Yeah.
The Jay Aruga podcast.
Yeah. So clearly it's a good marketing move as the first and only, but I was wondering, like, maybe if I can ask a bit personal reasons, when did you find out that you were a conservative, and how can you describe your convictions as a conservative?
Yeah, because I wasn't always a conservative in my life, because I was like listening to radio. So I'm a fan of Mo Twister, yung Boys Night Out, and mostly mga they're kind of liberal, in some sense, and I'm exposed to Hollywood movies, which are for the most part liberal. But then I was also an atheist for a big chunk of my life, and I had a conversion story, which I will not like go through here in this episode. But to cut the long story short, I'm convinced that theism is true. I read some stuff on the moral issues, on like on marriage, on sexuality, and I'm kind of convinced through during that time when I'm converting from atheism to theism, I need to be sure that these moral reasons are on good grounds through secular arguments, at least, not biblical arguments. So that's when I was convinced that many of the issues on the conservative side make sense. So at least for me. So I hope that answers your question.
It's interesting. Most people assume that young people, at least when you become conservative, it usually comes from parents or authority figures, and with us just copying. In fact, quite frankly, I used to be a bit more explicitly conservative myself, because I love my parents and they've talked to me about a lot of things and listened to them a lot of times. But of course, I expanded my world a bit, so I'm not really conservative. But what I noticed is that this is a very personal journey, and it's not. It breaks the mold. Like it's not just like following orders. It's thinking. So where did this thinking come from? Like why?
What's the trigger?
Why this? What's the trigger?
Yeah.
What made you think about these things?
Lots of things. Yeah, lots of things. So I'm a Catholic, kind of an apologist for Catholicism, and
Okay.
I've been debating with my friends. Some are Andating Daan, some are Jehovah's Witnesses, and of course they have their own beliefs, and I need to come up with like defense on some Catholic social teachings, moral teachings. So that's where the reading came from.
Right.
So yeah, there.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. So let's talk about like what you do in your podcast. So how do you decide which topics to discuss? And can you
Okay.
tell us more about the content that you do?
Yeah, mostly I discuss. I kind of hold recording the podcast until the last minute because you want your topics to be at least relevant when you release the episode. So I kind of hold recording. I I listen to news, then whatever comes out of the news that interests me, I talk about it. Like my last few episodes, I talk about same-sex marriage when Lito Atienza and Walden Bello and Marvic Leonen were debating about it through Twitter. So that's how I like talk. I thought of talking about it. Then the other one is about abortion in the case of rape. So it's from the Boy Abunda interviews with the presidential balls. So that's one way. And sometimes I have a pipeline of topics that I want to talk about.
Yeah.
So that's
cool.
yeah. So that's how I decide. And sometimes I just ask people what they want me to talk about. So I crowdsource for topics.
And what do you think is your most popular kind of content? Like with the most views and listens?
Good question. I always get a lot of listens when recently for some reason I don't want to endorse politicians, but whenever I talk about politics, I get a lot of listens, which I hate because I don't want to endorse anyone. It's kind of ironic. So that's one. Aside from that, what else? The gender ideology stuff. Whenever I talk about that, so there's not much people who talk about that in the podcast sphere in the Philippines, at least from a conservative standpoint. So I seem to get a lot of listens for that one.
That is cool. I think,
So,
dagdag ko lang, listening to the story of your podcast, I think you're tracking the same pattern as conservatism in the West. Because they came from responding to the rise of liberalism. I mean, Edmund Burke, which is one of the fathers of conservatism, he actually responded to the French Revolution. So that's where conservatism in England started. Same thing with the United States. So they were responding to rise of radicalism, so on and so forth. So in the Philippines, you're the one responding.
It seems
a
like
perceived
that.
imbalance, and that's cool.
Yeah, and to add to that, if I'm to describe conservatism in the Philippines, I would like to always use the G.K. Chesterton quote when describing conservatism in the Philippines. It's from the book The Thing. So he said that if you see a fence on the road, the more modern type of reformer would say, I don't see the use of this. Let's clear this fence away. The quote-unquote conservative would hold first at clearing the fence, and he will check why the fence is erected in there in the first place. So that's kind of my attitude when it comes to these issues. Like I would like for people to maybe look at the West first before we introduce something new here in our country, because we don't need to do the experiment in here in our country anymore, because we have the benefit of their hindsight, of the Western countries' hindsight of what happened when they tried these policies.
Yes. Yeah, the Chesterton's fence. We've mentioned that in this podcast before. But it's one of my favorite images, actually. So, so knowing that, well, Borge mentioned that a lot of your issues coincide, with the West. You have abortion, you have same-sex marriage, gender ideology. I was wondering if you can explain how much this resonates with your audience, and perhaps you can describe a bit like who your audience is and how, like, diverse is it here in the Philippines? How's your
Yeah, sure.
engagement?
Yeah. So normally my audience, and you'd understand that most are religious types because, as you mentioned, conservatism might have sprang out from like religious beliefs.
Yes.
The problem that I see is that not many of the conservatives, quote unquote conservatives, religious people here in the Philippines cannot articulate why they believe what they believe in. And I think that's why they want to listen to my podcast, because I kind of give them a good reason to defend their beliefs. So let's say on same-sex marriage, I kind of put I kind of put the question of what is marriage for, and so that's the root. It's not actually same-sex marriage versus opposite-sex marriage. When it comes to marriage, the opposing views are like conjugal view of marriage and the relational view of marriage. So the relational says that marriage is the highest form of relationship that we need to uphold. So that's one view. And the other view is that marriage is for the good of the spouses and the children that they might procreate. So those are the conversations that I kind of put forward with my audience. So I try as much as I can not to quote the Bible when talking about moral issues. So
that's fair.
Isn't that a challenge to create a secular version of conservatism here in the Philippines?
Actually, I find it. No, it's not that challenging. The challenge is like trying to explain things that the audience would easily understand.
Okay.
So that's the challenge. Aside from that, I think the challenge is like spreading the word. That's where the challenge lies.
Okay. I'm curious though, what kind of guests do you have on your podcast, like among Filipinos? Like, who are the conservative Filipinos that you managed to get on your show?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's a good question, because I'm a bit guilty of not inviting Filipinos that much. I kind of like I kind of I try to aim for the stars.
Oh,
Early on in this
international
podcast.
guests, you mean?
Yeah, mga
Okay.
international yung mga recent guest ko. But I will make it a point in my next season, because I'm having a season ender like this February. So season 3 will be done this February. My next season is on April. I'll make it a point na sa April I'll invite more Filipino guests, because there are a lot of other voices in the Philippines that needs to be heard.
Right.
Because there are somehow conservative groups here. There's ALFI, the Alliance of the Family Foundation of the Philippines. And there's Courage PH. So they're the people who are same-sex attracted, who are living their life in chastity. So there are a lot of people who need to be heard. Philippines conservative side. So I'm a bit guilty na nag-aim muna ako on foreign guests for this season.
Okay. But why do you have the foreign guests? I mean, no judgment, just curious.
No. Part of the reason is that they have good material. They write good books, and I would like people to know about them, to read their books. So I want to point the conservative movement to them. So that's one reason.
Right.
So and the other is maybe parang I'm a fan of them. There's some guys that I invited in my podcast that I'm a fan of.
Yeah. Do you have some favorites?
So I'm not sure if you know them. So there's Trent Horn.
Catholic, right?
Yeah, Catholic. So I guested him.
Oh wow, I'm familiar. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Jason Everett. So he's a chess
Yes, chess
speaker.
speaker. Yes, I went to his talk
Yeah.
one time here. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guested them on my
Mm-hmm.
podcast. So those are two of the notables that I guested in my podcast.
Still very religious, by the way.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
But if you listen to the content,
Mm-hmm.
they kind of talk about. So I invited Jason Everett to talk about the RH law, and he discussed it on a secular perspective. Same with Trent Horn. So we talk about the LGBTQIP2SAA movement, and he explained each letter: lesbian, gays, bisexual, trans, queer and questioning, intersex, pansexual, two spirits, asexual, and allies.
Mm-hmm.
I got lost.
I'm sorry.
So many. Yeah.
And it's still growing, definitely.
It is still growing.
So we talked about that. We talked about that, Trent and I. So those are some of the topics that we discussed in the podcast.
Yeah, so check that out in his channel. So yeah, great content. Now I'm curious though, like, did you ever get someone who was not conservative in your podcast, or do you plan to? Maybe someone with an opposing view and maybe talk to them and debate, or?
Yeah, that would be a good thing if I invite some in the podcast. The only limitation is I only release once a week. So during these times, I kind of want to put forward first, like the views that I am putting forward, and hopefully in the future I'd like to talk to people with opposing views. So for now, my quote unquote agenda is to kind of form the people on the defense on conservative values.
Yeah.
So that's why I invited first those from my side, and hopefully in the future, when time permits, I'd invite from the liberal side, from the left side of the spectrum as well. That's in my mind.
Okay. Before I forget, like, what are conservative values?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we mentioned, I think in your intro, you kind of touched on some of it. So conservatism is different. It's relative. It's relative to the place you're on, the time you're on. Like in a Muslim country,
yes,
conservatism conserves the Muslim values and tradition, and a Christian in a Muslim country would be the liberal one. So here in the Philippines, because we're in a time where we acquired and uphold many Christian values, what we're conserving are values that has something to do with those, like strong family bonds, marriage, particularly one man, one woman, which is permanent. We're pro-life as well, and we believe that life begins at conception. The reason I said that conservatism is relative is because in the US, the conservatives there are against gun control. Here we don't care that much about gun control. So yeah.
Are there any issues that, well, you still have a lot of intersections with American conservatism? Are there issues in Philippine conservatism that are not in American, like, are unique here? Like, can you name some of them?
I don't know. Divorce, we're still like fighting. At least the conservative movement is still fighting against the divorce law. They don't care much about fighting against the divorce law in there anymore because it's already legal. So
and we're the only country that's where it's illegal. So yeah,
along with the Vatican.
Yeah, along with the Vatican. Yeah,
along with the Vatican. So yeah, I can talk about that. I find it a feature of our country, not a bug.
No.
So why?
Because I see that there are a lot of stats and studies on the negative effects of divorce on children in a society. There are high rates of committing crime for children of divorce or from children from broken families, high rates of dropping out of high school, high risk of suicide, most of them are linked to divorce.
Mm.
I see this is a study from a website called Fatherless Foundation. So 1 out of 3 children grows up without their biological father anymore in their home. And 71% of fatherless children drop out of high school. Fatherless children are 5 times more likely to commit suicide, 32 times more likely to run away, 10 times more likely to abuse chemical substance, 20 times more likely to end up in prison. And aside from that, the US spent $112 billion a year to support broken families. And that's enough to power the economy of the Philippines. So imagine what divorce would cost our government and society. Those are some stats that I just want people to think about before going through an extreme measure of legalizing divorce. And of course, I recognize that there are like hard cases that like wife being beaten. And as of now, we have provisions for that for now in our country through legal separation, and annulment. So
we do have annulment.
A conversation needs to be made, and the danger is like in the RH law, it was like passed because the conversation are mostly religious. And the conservative side on that time were like priests, bishops, and no one took them seriously. I was, in hindsight, I think it could have been like defended better, the opposition to the RH law.
Kung secular siya.
That was a weird situation. Like, I think it got passed, but then it's also suspended. So it's a bit of a stalemate there.
but still passed. But
May tanong ko lang, since I think your previous statement, you gave us examples of conservative organizations and some differences. Could you provide us with a general layout of various conservative tendencies that you have observed dito sa Pilipinas?
Okay. Like I said, medyo parang bago lang yung conservatism dito sa Pilipinas. When I marketed my podcast as a conservative podcast, hindi ko akalaing may makikinig. Parang ang worry ko nun, parang meron bang makikinig dito? Parang most of the people who listen to podcasts are not conservative. Aminin ko. And so yung mga, and funnily, I found a conservative movement, a conservative page, medyo growing pa lang. So to answer your question, so there are the libertarian conservatives. So these are the ones who calls for limited government. So when we say limited government, they believe as much as possible that government should have little role in our lives, and government should only be involved in things that we can't do individually, or at least as a small community, like cementing the road, defending our country from invaders. So outside those things that we can do on our own, the government shouldn't be interfering in our lives that much. So an example of this is let's say the anti-bastos law. For a libertarian conservative, ethics shouldn't be legislated. So that's the libertarian conservative. And they will oppose the COVID restrictions as well and big tech censorship. So hindi ko lang ko, I would like to call myself a bit on the libertarian side. Medyo may pagka-libertarian ako on some stuff.
Okay.
I did an episode on COVID restrictions because I'm against the COVID vaccine mandate. So that's one. That's one of a lot. And like to continue, the opposite of the libertarian conservative is a bit authoritarian, but the word for the acceptable word for it is what you call the common good conservative. So they have no problem with some government regulations. For example, a common good conservative would want banning pornography because according to them, it's the common good if you do so. So pornography has nothing good to contribute to the world, and it endangers children who almost have easy access to porn in the internet. So a libertarian conservative would oppose this. So an example ng libertarian conservative is si Ben Shapiro, and I think Matt Walsh is the common good conservative. So nagkaroon sila ng konting back and forth on pornography before. So those are two examples, and siguro yung iba is social conservatives. So I think I'm on this kind of type of conservative. We're concerned on social issues such as abortion, marriage, the definition of man and woman, etc. There are the fiscal conservatives who are concerned on the economy. So they believe in less government intervention and regulations for the exchange of goods and services. So dito yung discussion on socialism versus capitalism. So it falls under the lap on the lap of the fiscal conservatives. Then there's like the nationalists. Then there are the religious conservatives. There's some called neo-conservatives. So I will not dwell on those anymore.
Yeah.
Ano ko lang, I asked this because I think our listeners should have the idea, first and foremost, that no ideology is monolithic.
Right.
There's
no
such
one
thing
conservatism. Yeah.
There's no such thing as a
May
monolithic.
nag-aaway pa nga sa ano. Oh, tama. May mga nag-aaway pa nga within the conservative movement eh. So hindi maiwasan yan. So,
Right. I was wondering if you, in your pods, have received like criticism. Like, what kind of criticism have you received?
Yeah. And of course, some criticism from the left, for instance. Says sometimes,
of course,
when you oppose gender ideology, medyo maraming maalma. And nangyari yun sa West, and hindi ako nagulat nung nangyari din sa akin dito. There's may parang troll na laging sumasagot sa lahat ng post ko during that time. And that's fine. At least tumataas yung engagement sa site. So that's what you want. So that's some mostly sa divorce, of course, dahil medyo touchy subject. Touchy subject yan, and a lot of people in the country are maraming hiwalay, and they would want a divorce law to be passed. So it's a touchy subject. Kaya hindi maiwasan yung criticism there.
Yeah.
But sometimes in order to tell the truth, sabi ni Jordan Peterson, you need to risk offending someone.
Papa Peterson, gotta clean your room.
Matt is a fan.
Clearly,
Nice.
I'm starting to talk like him, actually.
Nice.
Yeah. I have his books and everything.
But
anyway.
Stop tayo na lang kulang mo.
Anyway, no, and so okay, these are the criticisms. How have you responded to them?
I do respond to them to some point. Parang kasi when you respond in the internet, kind of it waits a lot of time. But you're kind of parang full of energy ka makipagsagutan eh. And it's kind of like in human nature. Pero it came to a point where some of the critics, I realized na parang they're not listeners of the podcast anyway, and parang there's no because sometimes what I do is I plant like their names, parang shout out ko sila sa podcast, and I would know kung nakikinig sila ng podcast, and they don't, hindi nila binibring up. So parang, okay, I'm responding. I'm wasting a lot of time responding to these people. Pero parang hindi naman sila yung audience ko. Talagang some of them are troll lang. Although I met people who are opposed to my views, who are really good people, and I have some back and forths with them. I'm part of a group who are into UBI, Universal Basic Income. And they're providing good points. So may konting back and forth ako with them. So
sorry, for our listeners, what is universal basic income, and is it applicable here in the Philippines? Because it's a talking point in the U.S. elections.
It is.
Yeah.
So see,
we're not wealthy enough for that.
Andrew Yang.
We're not wealthy enough for this.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So US, yun yung parang binring forth ni Andrew Yang when he was running for for president sa Democrat side. And even Elon Musk is pushing for it. So universal basic income is just says na we should all get a basic income tayong mga adults. So yun yung it's
premise.
a bit it's the basic premise. Maybe socialism because how do you get the income? Kasi even though one doesn't work, kahit yung taong grasa, he would get an income. Di ba? So yun yung pinaka gist niya. Kahit yung mga taong grasa, they get an income. Meron silang pangkain monthly. They'll receive it. So
doesn't that sound like socialism or
welfare?
It's a bit.
Yeah, it's a bit. It is actually. Yeah.
How's that conservative?
No. I sinasabi ko lang na I'm part of this group of liberals who are pushing universal basic income. So it's not
okay.
So I do listen to people who are like opposed to my views.
Yeah, but your position is
it is definitely a liberal position.
Okay.
No,
you don't agree with it.
No. I'm not saying I agree with it, but I haven't delved into it that much yet.
Okay.
But I see their points.
Okay. I can't believe that there are Filipinos arguing for UBI in the Philippines.
There are some, yeah.
I mean, we're not wealthy enough for that. First answer for
Oh my.
Actually, so well, you've articulated your views very well, but I do want to at least try to maybe simulate like maybe a probable criticism to conservatism. Say, for example, what would you say for someone listening to you right now? They might say, oh, a lot of these issues are based on the experience of America. Why do we Filipinos have to pay attention to these issues or these positions? What do you have to say to that?
Based on the experience of America. I would say that wouldn't we want to know how these issues affected them when they legalized, let's say, divorce or same-sex marriage? Because chances are, and I'm not saying that there's 100% chance that this would happen, but there's a chance that we would experience the same thing. Let's say when let's say on gender ideology, and I see the SOGI bill being debated upon in Senate, or we see in the US that there are some like talks on, like, let's say the bathroom bill in there. There are some, let's say, harassments that are happening in women's bathroom. So one is in Loudoun County in Virginia, where there's this boy who's dressed as a woman who entered the female bathroom and raped a female student there.
Yeah.
It could be a slippery slope, but at least consider that. And on the transgender issue, there are like let's talk about women's sports. Right now, Leah Thomas is dominating like the swimming in an Ivy League school. So Leah Thomas is trans woman who is competing on a women's division for swimming.
Right.
So and I could cite other examples like in track and field, like the first and second are trans women. Selena Soul was like opposed to that. It robbed her of possible scholarships on college scholarships. There are some who dominated in cycling and other sports. So those are things that happened in the US that we have the luxury now to examine, at least.
Okay.
And I don't see these talking points being brought out in Senate when
well, it's probably because even while the for example, you talked about trans issues like LGBT, like restrooms and sports. These like, even though they use common talking points, the LGBT activists here and in the United States. They do have intersections. But even the LGBT people here, I've talked to some of them, they do not have the same priorities or the same issues. Like, for example, while we do have gender neutral bathrooms, trans people in sports are not exactly a common issue here. I think this is part of like a larger, my next question, which is, what makes your conservatism Filipino? How is it grounded to the Philippine experience?
It's hard to ground it to the Philippine experience because I just want to ground it like on the truth. For instance, let's say when you talk about the difference between men and women, it's kind of universal. Like it's not just like an American problem, a US problem. It's universal throughout the world. So I'm not that concerned at grounding it much on the Philippines. My main concern is there's a bit of colonization, ideological colonization by the West, and maybe that's how if you would ask me how it concerns the Philippines. So maybe that's one, because it's a form of colonization, and we're a bit iffy when it comes to colonization. So
so that's basically your link with the left.
yeah. We're against colonization. That's a middle ground, I guess, with the left. Yeah.
Okay.
And we should always find middle ground.
Right.
Okay. Since I mentioned the left, again, I'm speaking from relatively radical position, but again, I do appreciate the arguments of the conservatives, and this is a question that I tackled myself, but I want to ask you about it. So, as a conservative, how would you respond to something that can be deemed as urgent, and how can you respond to change? What's your response to change?
And I understand that there needs to be a balance between the left and the right, and I acknowledge that we need the left as much as we need the right, because sometimes we could there's a danger that we could go too far to the right, and we need the left to pull us back. And in a healthy society, in an ideal society, journalism, for example, is inherently left-leaning, because journalism criticizes what's established order. So most of journalism reports like established order. If it sees something wrong, it criticizes it. And in an ideal society, that's needed for a check and balance. So let's say during the time when slavery in the US is legal, the left did very good talking points to end slavery, because if you're too far right, you could even like defend slavery. But that's one example of change that we need. So it needs to be a good balance, and we need to listen to each other.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I want to again explore this. How would you respond to this common criticism of the right when in saying, "Oh, you resist change because, so you're siding with the oppressor and privilege." Do you know these keywords? How do you respond to these?
Kind of Marxist,
Yeah.
So I don't know. We need to check. We need to ask what they mean by oppressor or privilege.
What do you mean by oppressor? Depends what you mean.
Because no one wants to like oppress like intentionally, and because you'd be evil if you do that. But there's a bit of a cycle, like one's oppress an oppressor to another. So that's why I want the terms to be at least precise when you say oppressor, privileged, who are those, and so I find it hard to answer that, because I kind of hate labels. And and this is kind of ironic because I label myself conservative, but there's we sometimes get hooked up with labels, and it kind of like put you in the box.
Yeah.
So that's my contention on labels.
Right.
I think what you hate are slogans. I also have a war with slogans.
Because let's say when you label, I know someone who when I asked her, and she's a lesbian, and when I asked her who is her name's, let's say, Rose. So, and I asked her, who is Rose? And she said, Rose is a lesbian. And it kind of made me think that, is that all that Rose is? Because you'd be like confined to being a lesbian, and there is so much more. Maybe lesbianism is just like a part of Rose. So that's one of the reasons I hate labels, because sometimes people live up to that label.
No, yeah.
So that's the danger there.
So yeah, the war against labels. No, that's ano lang kasi labels
even,
are
even conservatism. I call myself a bit center right. So hindi siya talagang conservatism. And between authoritarian conservatism and libertarian conservatism, I kinda dwell on that spectrum. I don't say like I'm a libertarian conservative, and the problem there is that makakahon ako on being libertarian.
Yeah.
There are things that I don't believe kailangan libertarian on, diba? So
yeah. And I think it's natural for humans to to label, because it's our tendency to simplify things. But something that I appreciated from conservative writings is they recognize the complexity of things. They recognize the complexity of mental processes of society itself.
Yeah.
Na hindi mo talaga, even if you try to simplify it through slogans or labels, hindi talaga kasya.
Yeah. Like say, for example, a lot of leftists would like to control the market, control the prices, like spend a lot of money here and there. But I think the conservatives would say, no, you don't know what that will do. I think that's the resistance to change. Like when you make a change, if you turn down the fence, you don't know what will happen. So it's cautious. It is a cautious position on
kaya nagkaroon ng free market socialism, if you're familiar with that. So may heterodox socialism.
That's new. Bago yan.
Free market socialist. So they need to have a balance.
Hindi ako magugulat kung may lumabas nga nun, because like yung labels talaga medyo parang medyo dangerous.
So I'm curious. Okay, maybe one issue again that is lobbed at conservatives is like, so how do you respond to like poverty? Don't we need to change in order to solve the massive poverty? Because I think we all can agree that Philippines is doing pretty badly, especially in the pandemic. So what do you have to respond to that?
That's a good question. And for a socialist, their answer to poverty is like socialism, because or communism. Kasi but it will open a lot of other problems that it can solve, in my opinion, and it will take another episode to discuss all of that.
Sure.
I think my answer to poverty, one is like strong family ties, because fatherlessness is linked to poverty. Like a lot of kids who grew up without a father most of them went to jail. And the one reason then why I'm against divorce is because it's also linked to poverty. Imagine parang pag naghiwalay yung mag-asawa, like the man or the woman would support two families now. And most of the conservative values are kind of like, if they're adhered to, it would at least solve a bit of poverty. So that's one. And my answer to poverty is, ito medyo religious to, is charity, of course. And the difference of charity to socialism is that you can't force people to be to have the virtue of charity. In socialism. Yun yung, that's the irony of socialism.
With charity, you prevent the concentration of wealth in the hands of the government, and then it also guarantees freedom. Now, regarding your question, Matt, I think I do have an additional something to add onto Jay's comments. As far as Hayek is concerned, and again, Hayek would do economic conservatism. This is the reason why he was called a communist by his fellow conservatives, because he advocated strongly for, first and foremost, breaking down monopolies. Plain and simple. For Hayek, there's a distinction between the free market and capitalism. He knows that. So free market is the one that can reduce poverty. Capitalism does not. So he makes that distinction.
Right.
Another one is he advocated for free education. Free education for all. For Hayek. And if we want to assert equality of opportunity, then that must happen. And another, he advocated for welfare for the elderly. So free health, free welfare for the elderly. So that's why he was criticized as a communist, even if he can be considered as one person. So I think I can add down to that one. But I think the first instinct, I don't know. I don't know, Jay, if you would agree with this one. I don't know if you would agree, but I would like to ask. But for a conservative, I think the first instinct when facing poverty is to distinguish different types of poverty. Is that apt to say?
Wait, what do you mean by different types, George?
Poverty at the collective level, or poverty caused by bad decisions, or poverty that is inherited.
That's a good thing to bring up, bad decisions, because sometimes inisip ng iba is if you just put a lot of money on something, it would solve the problem. And iba yung, if you remember, I think the World Health Organization said na if we have $6 billion, we'd solve world hunger. That was the Elon Musk. Sabi niya, okay, tell me how you'll solve world hunger. I'll sell $6 billion, I guess, or dollars worth of stocks.
Yeah.
Pero that's not always true eh. Kasi let's say sa New York during pandemic, yung mga hotels, they opened it up for the homeless. And it's a noble cause. But parang ang nangyari lang, naging drug dense tong mga hotels na to. And that's one example na parang if you have a lot of money, parang it doesn't always solve a lot of things. And that's one of my hesitation dun sa UBI. Because a lot of the reasons for poverty could be like personal decisions, why they got there. So,
Okay.
Wow.
Pero I think Hayek was targeting the inherited poverty. That's why he wanted to advocate free education.
Yeah.
Because he also knows that other than bad decisions, there are actual people who simply inherited poverty. So,
Actually, I do want to highlight something. And I think it reflects, of course, most of what Jay is answering, is that conservatives tend to pin down problems based on individual levels. In other words, we don't want to change structures because the structures are fine. It's bad because of bad actors, like because of people choose not to work on their families, or there are corrupt individuals. So if we get rid of those individuals, then the system works fine. The problem is with the left, they believe that the structure itself should be rearranged. And of course, I think there are some conservatives that would say, yes, adjust a bit, but we have to at least examine like what should be, what should be kept and preserved and what should be changed. So that's a difference in attitudes towards change. And I think, I do want
you nailed
to,
it.
Yeah, okay. I do want to bring this up before we move on to more contemporary politics. What I've been trying to hammer on, and I think this is one facet of conservatism that's somewhat missing in a lot of conservatives now, and I think that is, of course, national identity. Like a Filipino values, because normally conservatives would have like French conservatives would have French values or the French identity. America would have their Make America Great Again, American values, American tradition. I actually noticed that, well, even in Jay's answers, like they're not particularly concerned with it. And I think it's also because it's unfair, because it's actually, when the left was consolidating itself, it's not only Marxist, but it also got the nationalist identity. So it's like when you play chess, they start with some of your pawns as well. because so it's like the Philippine identity, Filipino language, Filipino culture. I think the left co-opted that before the right could. So that's why, in a way, I feel your frustration. Like, that's why I actually strongly believe in establishing a national identity. But that's, I think, what's missing with a lot of with conservatives, because I think the left took that identity politics part away. So I don't know. You want to react to that? Either of you? Because that's a core component in all conservatives, and we don't have that here in the Philippines. So
there's none. Yeah, and in other countries, there's what they call the nationalist conservatives, who concentrates more on like national interest, conserving their cultural heritage, and I'm not sure. It could be like I'm not that fan of tribalism, for instance, and sometimes there are a bit things to criticize on certain cultures that you don't have to hold on to.
Right.
So that's kind of my critique on national identity.
Yeah.
And besides, parang what national identity are we holding on to? Because we have different like islands. Like if you go to Baguio, they have a different culture than the one in Batangas, for instance, or the one down south. So it's kind of vague what to hold on to. So maybe I don't see it working here in the Philippines.
I understand.
Okay. No, regarding your critique of tribalism and national identity, Marx would agree with you. That's why
that's not very conservative.
That's why the left obtaining the national discourse or the national issue, it's actually quite contradictory with Marx's idea. Marxist idea, not Marxist. Marxist idea.
Yeah.
But okay, I think I need to correct you with this one. The left capturing the national, the national nation building issue. Again, Marcos did capture it. So just to clarify,
to a point,
the left recaptured it, but Marcos had it, and now it's reemerging. So I don't think that there's a total absence of,
right-wing nationalism here in the Philippines.
Non-leftist nationalism. So
Not for the most part.
Not for the most part. I mean, Marcos apologists would always have their own idea of the nation that is distinct from the left. So let's not overgeneralize that it's more or less captured. I think it's under contention right now. I think that's what is clear. It's being contested. You have the leftist discourse, and then you have the re-emerging Marcosian.
I actually didn't know that. Probably because it's difficult to take Marcosians seriously.
Kaya kilos ang bagong lipunan. That's basically their slogan for their nationalism. That is anti-communist.
Yun pala. Any reaction, Jay?
No, I think I'll need to read more on that.
I read Marcos.
But I don't want to call it conservative. That's why I said Marcosian. I'm not comfortable calling it conservative yet.
Right. But we would agree that there is a lacuna or a silence in terms of a right-wing conservative nationalism? Or does it exist?
Silence, or the other camp is just noisier.
Okay.
Probably,
we just hear about them more, but okay.
No, I'll read about it more because I like I said, I am more on the social conservative side and not that much on the nationalism side.
Yeah. Okay, but it's been a long discussion about that. But I think that we can move on from the general parts of conservatism to perhaps what a conservative would think about the current national elections. So this is going to be fun. Yeah,
you're putting me on the spot.
Yeah. Now we're not forcing you to, of course, say who you're voting for, but perhaps just make a quick comments on each of the candidates. All right. So what do the conservative we critique or praise about this particular candidate? So let's start with the front runner.
Leni Robredo.
Bongbong Marcos. Bongbong Marcos. Okay. What would you think about that?
No. Before anything else, I would like to say a disclaimer that
Sure.
I chose not to endorse anyone in my podcast for the presidency, and I'll try my best not to sound like endorsing someone here. Okay. So Bongbong Marcos. Okay.
Yes.
So for a conservative, he's anti-divorce, so that's one good point for him. He seems to be pro-abortion for rape when he was asked by Boy Abunda in the Boy Abunda interviews. And during his 2016 run for vice president, he was pro same-sex marriage, which is kind of like a conservative wouldn't agree with that. He's pro death penalty during his 2016 run. He said that, and he will not apologize for his father's atrocities. So the only conservative point that I see in him is his anti-divorce stance.
Oh,
so that's Bongbong Marcos.
So, Medj, you'd be surprised that there are many people in the religious people supporting Bongbong Marcos. Do you have anything to say about that?
I don't know. Siguro dahil solid north and minsan may mga south din. Siguro yung mga they thought Duterte is supporting him because Sara Duterte is under him. Is BP. So yung mga ka-DDS medyo nawalan sila ng susuportahan when like Bongo or Bato. Wow. Nagano sila nag-withdraw sila from the race. Kaya parang who will we support now?
Yeah. Okay. That's it on Bongbong. Yeah. What about the next, the second runner-up, Leni Robredo? What did you think about Leni Robredo?
Okay, I'll just base this from her interviews. So she said she's open to ease up annulment, although she said she's anti-divorce. Although she said she also said she's not for same-sex marriage but same-sex union. She when pressed by Boy Abunda, she seems to like lean pro-life but open to talks on decriminalization of abortion. She's anti-death penalty. Although what's concerning is the covenant she made with the LGBTQ plus. So I don't understand the word covenant. When they said covenant, may pinatay ba silang may pinatay ba silang hayop or something?
Sakripisyo ng kambing yun.
Sakripisyo ba sila ng kambing? So there. That's what I think of Leni. I'm just stating the facts. Hindi ko sinasabi kung should conservative vote for her or not. But from the past interviews and debates, ito yung mga responses niya.
Yeah, I just noticed right now that although she represents liberals and progressives, and she has espoused, of course, a lot of compassionate welfare, focus on the Laylay and Soji, marginalized groups, she's actually kind of conservative as well. She doesn't want to comment on these things, which is interesting to me.
Because couples for Christ siya before she and her husband, and she has like Catholic values.
Yes.
And I think yun yung medyo core niya. And most of the people in the Liberal Party naman din talaga, since parang from their youth medyo they were molded by maybe Catholic values siguro nung pagtanda. Hindi din talaga liberal Kaya let's say si Pinoy for instance, or most of the Aquinos for instance, they're close church, kaya they're really not liberal like the Western
in a Western sense
liberal.
I think Leni is just trying to based on that one, she's just trying to open discussions. So no hard stances.
And it's like parang convenient for her politically dahil parang wala siyang ine-exclude.
Yeah.
So medyo
Buhay lahat. Yeah.
wala siyang na-exclude. So I think that's a good strategy for her.
Okay. The old link between liberal thought and conservatism. They're not that mutually exclusive anyway.
Interesting. Although I understand, like I know a lot of people in the church who kind of are leaning to Leni, but are uncomfortable with her LGBT font because her loudest supporters are LGBT. Yeah, so that's interesting. Anyway, it's up to them to decide.
At least, yeah. I'd like to bring it up na endorse siya ng parang Leoddy. Ng Leoddy. So
I do think she also has like endorsers among priests, mga kakampare.
Kaya
kakampare. Cute.
Anyway. Baka nahalata na lang. We're talking about Leni too much.
Yeah.
Let's move on. She's on the gray area.
Medyo gray area nga.
It's interesting to analyze. It doesn't mean we're voting for her anyway. But yeah, next one we have Isko Moreno. Isko Moreno Domogoso.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yep. All right.
What do you think about Isko?
Okay. During the Jessica Soho interviews, he said he's pro-divorce. Although he said no to same-sex marriage, kind of surprising because medyo close siya sa LGBTQ plus movement, and he painted like yung pedestrian nga ng rainbow colors.
Yeah.
So I don't know what he's thinking there. Pero ayun, he had a good answer in the abortion question by Boy Abunda when asked about abortion for rape. Actually, in my personal opinion, he had the best answer among the other candidates. He's anti-death penalty, so that's some points for Isko. So there, yun lang. I think my hesitation for Isko is although sinabi niya he says no to same-sex marriage, baka mamaya parang is very close to the LGBTQ plus community. Baka yung mga bathroom bills medyo mag-ano siya doon,
mixed signals.
Mag-mix signals siya doon.
Yeah.
Yun lang, and parang ano ba?
Yeah. I mean, he's anti-same-sex marriage pero gumagiling siya para sa lahat. Diba?
Para naman sa lahat
Para sa lahat.
Again, understand kung bakit parang you'd like all the votes you can get. Kaya para you magano ka, parang sasaguan ka sa dalawang ilog or something. Parang yung hindi ko tama yung idiom.
Yeah. I mean, which is odd because that particular answer about abortion sounds more like Manny Pacquiao. He said like, only God can take away the life. He can give it, but he can take it. But only him. This is very... You see, I think he's courting Manny Pacquiao's voters. Yeah. He's courting everyone, actually. That's
although,
interesting about that. Yeah.
Although Leni could have had a good answer there, pero mukhang hindi lang niya ma-articulate well because maybe hindi siya apologist hindi siya pro-life apologist, but she seems to be parang alam mo yung sasabihin niya parang for abortion, for like when the mother's life is in danger, and tama nga naman there are provisions, but not abortion. It's what we call the principle of double effect. So it's not really abortion, but if you can save the life of the mother, you take away. Medyo mag-geek out na ako on that stuff, but medyo ano lang siya, parang hindi understandable because she's not an apologist, kaya siguro hindi niya na-articulate well, but yun.
Yeah. All right. So that's Isko Moreno. Next we have Ping Lacson. Yeah.
Okay. So Ping, I thought nung una he is one of the most conservative candidates because kasama niya si Tito Soto, which is mostly conservative, si Tito. But nagulat ako, he's pro-divorce dun sa Jessica Soho interview. He's for civil union, sa same-sex marriage. Medyo the same kay Leni. When it comes to the abortion issue, when it comes to rape, he said he needs to research on it more kasi nagbigay ng stats si Boy Abunda on him. And I think he has the second best answer dun sa issue na yun. Because if you don't know the answer, talagang kailangan mong it's okay to say I don't know if you don't know the answer. Kasi mag-ano ka, kasi mag-invento ka and i-ano mo lang. Yeah. So that's fine. He said he's anti-death penalty, pero I don't know. Medyo
I mean, actually, the weird thing is, I think I forgot this, but usually a core attribute of a right wing or conservative is usually they're pro rule of law, at some level. And I think being somewhat represented, being a former police and anti-corruption czar, because of his experience. But of course, I don't know. What do you think about that? Like, do you trust him on that?
By the way, sabihin ko lang yung death penalty thing sa US, ang conservatives are pro-death penalty and the liberals are anti-death penalty. Here, medyo hati ang conservative movement on death penalty. But I'm part of the conservative movement na anti-death penalty.
Okay.
So yun, I'll just come clean on that. So,
okay.
And I'll just add, by the way, na although pinag-usapan natin mga stand ng mga candidates on issue, iba yung sa debate tsaka iba yung sa actual. So you need to discern on that as well. Kasi si Duterte, sinabi niya na parang mag-jet ski siya sa Scarborough during the debate, di ba? Pero nung actual na, parang he kissed Chinese arse.
Oh yeah.
Kaya iba yung debate and actual. So we're just laying down the facts kung ano yung mga sinabi na sa debate.
That's it for Ping.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And then, of course, Manny Pacquiao.
So, si Pacquiao talagang pinaka-conservative candidates. And, he's anti-divorce. Ayon dun sa Jessica Soho interview. He's anti-same-sex marriage. Hindi siya nagbago ng stance on there ever since. He's yung sa abortion question with Boy Abunda, medyo pareho sila ni Isko, pero parang hindi lang niya ma-articulate well. Kaya binigay ko kay Lacson yung second best answer. Kasi better pa nga yung I don't know answer ni Lacson kaysa kay Pacquiao. Medyo naglaro-laro siya dun sa and he was pro-death penalty before. Tapos ngayon, medyo anti-death penalty na siya. And recent lang siya nag-change. Kaya, I just want to lay down that fact. So, but overall, he seems to be the most conservative presidential ball.
Does that mean you're inclined to vote for him?
There are different factors.
Okay.
So, I won't tell people na to vote for this guy or not. Maybe may tinatawag na parang one issue or two issue voter, di ba? Parang so maybe you're not that kind of a person.
Okay. So. But what would theoretically speaking, a conservative have what kind of doubts would they have with Manny Pacquiao, despite having a lot of agreements with issues with conservatives? Religious conservatives.
Kaya nga. So actually ang pinaka-criticism lang kay Pacquiao is like his experience in politics. So, hindi, and yung sabi ni Leni, di ba, why not Pacquiao? Tinanong siya ni Boy Abunda. Hindi sapat ang mabuting kalooban lang. And yun usually yung criticism kay Pacquiao. And maybe for some, baka mamaya yung sapat na. So who knows? I won't stop you kung gusto nyo i-vote si Pacquiao if you're a conservative. Maybe for you, mukhang baka yun lang pala talaga ang kailangan natin, yung mabuting puso.
Maybe.
So maybe. So,
si Mami Junisha lang kailangan natin.
Magdadasal siya, makukulam siya ng kalaban niya. Oo. I miss her so much. Parang hindi siya malabas, no? The weird thing about that is Leni could have easily bullied Pacquiao, but she actually handled it well. But at the same time, I think you pointed out something interesting, is that conservatives usually respect experience and tried and tested methods. That's why they want to conserve things, because they're tried and tested. And in Manny Pacquiao, in politics, well, the record, let's just say it's mixed, to say the least, to put it kindly. And I suppose the last one, there are more, but for now, the last one is Leoddy de Guzman, the
Okay,
labor worker. Yeah. So, what do you think?
Hindi ko siya nakita dun sa Jessica Soho and Boy Abunda, kaya I don't know much about him other than he seems to be pro same-sex marriage. He seems to be close to the socialist people of the country, and that's a major red flag yon sa isang conservative. That's all I can get kay Leoddy. Kaya wala ako masyadong I don't want to talk much about him kung wala talaga ako masyadong nabasa.
Okay.
I mean, he is a Marxist, labor groups.
Hindi naman siya nabigyan ng masyadong exposure again. So.
That's true. That's unfortunate.
At least on issues na concerned ang conservatives. So at least on those issues.
Yeah. Okay. So that is it. Thank you for sharing your observations and comments on all these. That's very detailed. I appreciate that. And now I think this is the time that we wrap this up with the final question. So, of course, we've talked a lot about conservatism. I want you to maybe give an open statement to two groups. Number one, to your fellow conservatives, and what do they want to tell them? What do they need to do, especially with the elections? And number two, perhaps to non-conservatives, and maybe talk to them maybe what do they need to know? What are they getting wrong? What don't they understand? Something like that. So perhaps the open message starts now.
Okay. So fellow conservatives, I think what I can say is just try to reach out to the other side as much as you can. Try to explain at least in a charitable way what we believe in. Don't be weird when talking to them. Please.
Good advice.
Yeah, please. So at least because that's how we could at least influence the culture and try to vote according to your conscience. Because sabi ni Andrew Breitbart, politics is just downstream of culture. And this is one reason why I'm not that much into the politics. And one reason I started this podcast is at least to change minds or at least inform conservatives so that they may reach out to the other side. And if they change mind, then good. So I'm asking them to join me in this content creation stuff because there's not much of us here. So yun lang. And aside from that, don't be weird for the most part.
All right, go ahead. Yeah.
So on the other side naman, to the liberal side, I think just try to hear what a conservative has to say, because there are at this point sa YouTube marami ng mga available na material from conservatives. I love listening to some liberal guys, and the Young Turks, crush ko si Ana Kasparian kaya the Young Turks yung pinapakinggan ko. So yun lang. So liberals, please give us a chance, have a dialogue with a conservative, and maybe listen to my podcast. Ipopromote ko na. Perhaps I could explain at least why we believe what we believe in. And other than that, just stick to the truth. If you think something is true, just give it some thought. Maybe who knows what the rabbit hole might bring you.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you very much. Actually, thank you for that open message for both. Borj, anything to perhaps wrap this up? Your observations with our discussion today.
No, okay. I think the first one is again, we have our own twist on conservatism. So we have the likes of Jay here speaking on conservative values here in the Philippines. But I think one thing that just to add on to Jay's message to the other side, which is I'm also from the other side, but I have a bridge with conservatism, and for conservatives and liberals, both of these schools of thought are concerned with liberty. Simple as that. So they're both concerned with the question of liberty. So if there's a dialogue can only start if you reassert the question. So what is liberty? How can liberty be ensured? In the question of change, progress, and so on. So, no naman. Tsaka I think if we have leftists and radicals listening, I have already pissed you long enough, and I would piss you off again. And my suggestion is that you read the conservative literature. That's a must. I remember having students back in the LSU. So one of them is a right-wing conservative, the other one is a leftist. I told the leftist to read Hayek's Road to Serfdom, and I told the right wing to read The German Ideology by Marx. So, expand. We're searching for the truth. So I think that's priority really.
Yeah.
And you mentioned nga liberty. It's the same root word doon anong binanggit ko kanina, yung libertarian, conservative, and liberals. It's the same root word na pinanggalingan ng two factions na yan.
I don't know. I've been thinking about this, and as someone who I really appreciate having Jay on the show, and of course doing what he's doing, because honestly, like I was I think he and I are very similar. Clearly, we listen to the same people, and like if he didn't put on the podcast, maybe I would have. But I would like to thank him for going on before me. But I do empathize with a lot of what he's saying, and I think we have to realize that there are really two stereotypes of conservatives. Number one, those who refuse to change and refuse to think. In other words, ganito talaga, ganito ako. And the other one is people who think too much, and like who are immersed in, reading and thinking about things, who think before they act. And I think it's clear that Jay seems to be part of the latter, which is a better part, but he's clearly open to things. But I think that's one thing we can get from conservatives, at least. Well, Borj, you and I joked the PI podcast is actually a conservative podcast because our way of thinking is more like a conservative because they look for evidence, they look for logic before they can want for change. A lot of the people on the left, they in a way impulsively want to change the system. They hate authority, and I think our instinct is, okay, well, which part of authority at least? I think that's a conservative instinct there. And second, the thing about, I think maybe we can discuss this in another podcast, but Borj, maybe you can comment that distinction between culture as politics as downstream from culture. Do you have anything to say about it? Because I find it's bothered me. I'm familiar with the quote, but
regarding that one, politics is a downstream culture. I go back to Hayek, and again, Hayek doesn't want to be called conservative, but he's being claimed by economic conservatives. He's a liberal as far as his own identity is concerned, but I think his idea may tackle this one. It is about the spontaneous order for Hayek. A spontaneous order is the emergence of norms and ethics, and out of this comes law. There's no such thing as law imposing itself and changing norms. It's always norms and ethics. Informed by social practices, culture. It's just like what Jay said earlier. You cannot legislate ethics. That's basically what the spontaneous order is all about. You cannot legislate ethics, and out of these norms, laws emerge.
Right. Because of course the left believes in the other way around. Like politics can impose a culture.
There might be a chicken and egg thing there as well. There's a law and culture. Parang someone ask which came first, the law or the culture, and there's in some instances yung culture yung come out of the law, and some instances yung law yung come out of the culture.
It's better to look at it more as a process, really. It's a historical process. No one school of thought have a monopoly on explaining the entire thing.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. There are clearly a lot of branches that we can go on and on, but this has been very enriching. So thank you very much for that. Then we go on to our final segment, which is recommendation. podcast where we recommend pieces of culture like books, movies, videos, or whatever that can help supplement or add to the discussion we had today. So as the guest, we go to Jay first, and then Borge, and then finally with me. Okay, so Jay, what do you recommend for our listeners?
Okay, so I'm debating to myself if I'll recommend the Red Pill documentary by Cassie J or Them Before Us, the book by Katie Faust. So
Do both.
I think
Yeah.
di ba isa lang yung paparecommend nyo? But see, what I did there, parang
some people
na-recommend.
can do like 2 or 3,
Okay.
on average. Yeah.
Pero see what I did there, I recommended both unintentionally na, because just by mentioning them. Pero sige, i-recommend ko na lang for the sake of time yung the book Them Before Us by Katie Faust, and it's a very good book because it talks about divorce, same-sex marriage, IVF, which is big fertility, yung industry ngayon sa US na. And it talks about from a child's perspective because yun yung nakakalimutan natin sa culture. And the main theme of the book is children's well-being first before adult desires. And sometimes parang in all of the discussions dito sa mga laws na to, na isasang tabi yung mga bata. Kaya that's one book that I would, if there's only one book I would like to recommend. So that's it. Them Before Us by Katie Faust. So it's full of stats. So some of the stats that I mentioned earlier is from that book. And it's a fun read as well. So may heart as well. So yun lang.
All right, thank you.
Nice.
Borge, yeah.
For my case, I would. I think I already cited him, Edmund Burke, but I'll recommend read the Reflections on the Revolution in France by Edmund Burke. For those who would like to go deeper into political conservatism. So this book is a bit challenging because the first half is insightful, second half is just would piss you off. but it is a challenge to read, especially if you're from the radical side. But you would learn much, especially with the value of tradition, the inevitability of tradition. And I think this is what the left is missing. The left has no idea of what tradition is. And in fact, they are already traditional. I think the left right now is one of the, not conservative in an ideological sense, but, or practically conservative bodies here in the Philippines na hindi na sila nagbabago ng tactic or whatnot. But yeah, so awareness of the value of tradition would be there. But another recommendation would be The Young Pope. So the series, The Young Pope. That was really good.
Oh, I love that.
I love that. Yeah.
So again, the focus is on the person, character development, which is a good way to look at it. But I think it gives you at the, I would not call it superficial, but at the first levels, what religious conservatism is and would look like when pushed to an extreme.
Yeah.
And I like that series because I actually fantasize about being that kind of pope. I know, if you remember, Matt, in one of our department pantry conversations, what would happen if I'm pope? I'll probably I would reinstate everything from the Swiss army to. So yeah, basically it's a fantasy come true, but
some radical.
Yeah. Kiss my ring. So
yeah.
So this is an exploration of man's character in relation to ideas and conservatism itself.
That show is interesting because Jude Law, of course, is a young and well, mediagenic kind of person, and when he becomes pope, you'd expect him to be, again, progressive, radical, but actually he's like Pope Pius the 13th. He chose one of the oldest names, one of the most recurring. That's
after Hitler's pope.
Yes.
Yeah.
Pope Pius the 12th.
So he became very scary and very, in a lot of ways, well, some people would say regressive, but for a purpose. And it did do well. I don't want to spoil too much, but it did do what he wanted. So it's a very complex, like it's not pro-conservative as is, but
it is not
the dynamics of religion.
Yeah.
I don't know, just watch it. It's really good.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. Okay, so I can recommend 2 things, and I think along with Young Pope, they can be found in the HBO Go app. These are things that I've been watching lately. And Jay said that entertainment has been very liberal and progressive. I'm recommending actually things that have a slightly more compassionate critique of conservatism. Actually, two pieces of media, and they're quite lighthearted and very interesting. Number one, it's an animated movie, series now. It's called The Croods. It's animated. It's about a family of cavemen, and it's interesting cast. It's starring, of course, the dad character starring Nicolas Cage, and then he's head of the family, the father, and all of a sudden there's this new, younger, sexier character played by Ryan Reynolds. And all of a sudden, of course, the family is kept together because of the father's traditional ways and methods. And then all of a sudden, this younger guy has tools that can help them, like, for example, survive, get food, get safe, etc. So now they want this younger guy, he's more popular. So that's interesting. So it clearly shows that progressivism, or innovation is actually a good thing. But and for a time, it maligns the father. But eventually, just in general idea, in the end, they were put into a situation where the father needs to save the day. So in a way, it shows that sometimes you need a younger and innovative leader, and sometimes you need the old ways. Yeah. So it's that kind of, that kind of flexibility, that kind of respect for both tradition and innovation. And it's rare you'd find that in modern media. I mean, the second one is also nice to watch, but it's a bit more wokey. But the first Croods is actually interesting entertainment that actually takes a look at that dynamics between tradition and innovation. And the second one, and I think Borj, and I watched this, is Peacemaker, directed by James
I haven't
Gunn.
seen this yet. I meant to see. So nag-subscribe ako sa HBO Max for this.
Yeah.
But don't spoil too much.
Okay.
Well, oh my God. It's going to be so hard because it's funny because, of course, James Gunn is a victim of cancel culture because of a tweet he said. And I think he clearly, it's clear in his work, he's critiquing that. And it's an interesting twist when he actually has a direct jab at woke politics. It's clear, but when you watch it, it celebrates, of course, in a way, comedy that is sexist, racist, but also poking at fun at this guy because he like John Cena, the Peacemaker's character, is like the anti-hero villain from Suicide Squad. But it's an arc that, in another way, how would you deal with and follow someone who is racist, sexist, and old-fashioned like that, masculine, macho? And it's heartwarming because there's clearly he learns, but also he still stays himself. It doesn't bully him too much. I mean, clearly there are some nods to woke people, but at the same, I think that's ideal entertainment. Although, yes, it represents some liberal ideas. It has a compassionate critique of like old macho characters and traditions. So, but it's again critique made with compassion. It doesn't malign them too much. So that's what they have in common. So check those out. I didn't spoil too much, but it is. I think you'd enjoy it. Yeah. Yeah.
Nice.
So yeah. Okay, that is it for our recommendations. And before we go, Jay, would you like to promote your podcast and where they can find it?
Yeah, the Jay Aruga Show podcast, available on Apple, Spotify. You know the drill, guys.
Yeah.
So,
Oh yeah.
wherever you listen to this podcast, it's there. So yun lang, the first conservative podcast in the Philippines. So
the first. Yeah.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for inviting me. I think we could go on and on.
Yeah.
Pag-uusap natin. But syempre, we're limited on time.
Yeah.
Thanks for inviting me, guys.
Yeah. And this need not be the only time. We can work this out. Maybe
of course,
Yeah.
We'll
Thank you very much. Yeah. This has been very fun. So thank you very much. Please check his channel out. It's very informative, clearly. I mean, we only gave you a taste of what he discussed. But of course, please stay tuned to our channel. This is only the first of many when we talk about people from different political ideologies and different. So we're going to talk to feminists, liberals, Marxists, environmentalists, whatever ists, anarchists. Okay, watch out for that. So yeah, in order for you to be updated on that, please follow us on Facebook, Spotify, and Anchor. If you have any comments, suggestions, or simple messages, you can send us at pipodcastph@gmail.com. But until the next episode,
magandang gabi, mga ka-PI.